Good evening. You're listening live to the Extreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob, broadcasting to you, of course, from the Extreme Studios just west of Orlando, Florida. I sort of have on the line, but not really yet, the young 20-something Professor Pixel, also from Central Florida. And tonight's Extreme TV selection is that of the Mission Impossible from the 60s, the original TV show that started off the entire spy franchise here. And of course, we're going to be talking about season one, episodes 1 and 2. And so, one of the first things I want to jump in, just kind of briefly talking about Mission Impossible is, of course, I remember Peter Graves from the University of Minnesota. And those of you that are familiar with Peter Graves from, say, Airplane and other things know that Peter Graves is from the University of Minnesota, as so affectionately pointed out in Mystery Science Theater repeatedly. One of the things, though, about season one that as soon as I started watching the first episode, I was like, damn, no Peter Graves. Where's Spock? That was my other question. Because obviously this is a cast of people that you're not 100% familiar with, too, except for maybe Martin Landau in the first episode where he plays the, how shall we say it, the master of disguise. And I thought this was pretty interesting because this is late 60s when the show is going on. It ran for a bit and, of course, got rebooted in the 80s for those of you that remember that. The first thing I think, and probably even last for people that don't know, when you talk about Mission Impossible, is you have to talk about the score, the songs that were Layla Schifrin or whatever, phenomenal. It's exciting. As soon as it starts off, you know you're in for something special. I think that that hasn't lost its luster at all over the years, much in the same way as the original score from Get Carter, even though reimaged by Stallone in say 2000, they did kind of a electronic mix on that score too. Still, if the score is good, it's going to be good. It's hard to really screw it up, and this thing nails it. One of the things too I noticed about this movie before even really talking about some of the actors or the story or their plot is just that I was struck for 42 minutes roughly, whatever it is that the episodes run on there for an hour show, just how fast this thing moves. There's no screwing around. There is no, we're going to stand around and talk about stuff for 10 minutes and then maybe get in the process of doing stuff. No way. BS. This show goes, you get your plot within like 2, 3 minutes, and boom, you're setting it up. You're get your group together. It's fast paced, and it's fast paced in such a way because it's so tight with what they do that it gives a part of the episode later on to breathe a little bit, which I'll talk about here in a moment. But it makes you go, "Holy crap! I got to pay attention to this. I can't just sit back and let it develop." Another popular show in the early '60s was obviously the original Star Trek, which I'm a fan of. About a third of the shows are phenomenal, third are mid, and third are dreck, but still entertaining. But once you started watching Star Trek shows, you kind of had an idea of what to expect when it comes to that shows. I think here with Mission Impossible, you kind of see that too, because early on we see the genesis of them getting the mission should they choose to accept it in the record player store and all that. And that's kind of cool. It's kind of neat how quickly they also get their cast together. And so they show the guy in the 60s get up, and he's going through some pictures. And of course, he's got the super hot model, he's got the safe cracker, he's got the dude doing what's called an overhead press, which fell out of favor in early 70s for you weightlifting fans out there. So they got the jacked up jabroni on there because they're in episode one. Their first mission, of course, is to get some nuclear warheads from a country that really doesn't exist, sort of thing. And you're flying. You're within 5, 10 minutes. You're there. You're in the new country. You're getting your room. It's like, okay, they're not screwing around. What I did not expect, and I have to say this for the first 2 episodes, was the fact that once they get there in the episode with whatever happens and how elaborate it is, they take time just kind of letting the camera show you what it is that they're trying to do, whether it's the woman being seductive or sultry, however you want to call it in 60s terms, and everybody else going through stuff. They let the actors act without there being a lot of talking. And I think one of the key scenes that comes to mind is obviously is in a Brian De Palma remake with Tom Cruise. In the first one, everyone always thinks about the suspension scene, right? Where you get the setup of how he's got to drop down on a wire. It can't drop a bead of sweat anywhere. It's climate controlled, temperature controlled, all these things. There's no way you could possibly do it. So you know how hard it is. So you don't have to focus on those things. You get to focus on Tom Cruise acting it as he's almost touching the bottom and the drop of sweat comes off his forehead and everything. I go, it makes me appreciate what Brian De Palma did in that first movie when they rebooted it. And then, of course, the second one was a John Woo film. To me, it was not a Mission Impossible film. And then, of course, I think from the third one on, they take it in the direction it's currently in now. And I go back to these first 2 episodes and I go, "Damn, they really kinda nailed it as far as, just not screwing around." I keep saying that, but I was struck really hard by that. T saying in chat there, definitely remembering the A's Mission Impossible, but it respects what came before it. Yeah, and I think that's the good thing too, because one of the things that we've talked about here on the Extreme Movie Show, or even its sub shows like Extreme TV Tonight, is that it's one thing to have a title of something, but if it's not really respecting the source material or interpreting it in a way that keeps the spirit of what made the original successful, which is the key, then you're just taking a dump on it. And of course, everything that's kind of retconned these days, politically speaking, and all that stuff. I won't get into details. You know what movies you are. Indiana Jones, I'm looking at you. But then you take something like Top Gun, which really isn't retconning it, but it's just doing it in today's terms. They knew what made it popular, but of course, Tom Cruise being involved in the original, it's easy to do. When you look at Mission Impossible from say 65, 66 when this started, and here we are, what, 34 or 54, almost 60 years later, you're still able to do it. It's a simple template, but you got to allow your actors the room to kind of breathe and do their thing. And one of the things too that I think in the 60s gets lost on the cultural part to it is that, in a movie we're going to be talking about here in an hour here on Extreme Movie Show with special guest Eric Breen, we're going to be talking about a movie from the early 90s with a very star-studded cast, Mickey Rourke, Steve Guttenberg, a ton of people, Kevin Bacon, a bunch of them, called Diner. Diner kind of set the scene for kind of how movies could be shot. We'll talk more about that specifically, but culturally it was very influential, trying to capture what was going on in the 50s, and that's the gist of the movie. For Mission Impossible in the 50s going to the 60s, all of a sudden you have the Cold War. And after World War II, things being more modern, I think, on television is less more about farms and cowboy kind of stuff, which is still extremely popular. Westerns, do not get me wrong, they still dominated television and TV at that time. You saw a lot of people live in rural areas and on farms. But back in the 60s, you saw more of a turn towards life in the big city and a little bit in the suburbs, say like with Leave It to Beaver in the 50s. So in the 60s, you had culturally, the countercultures, I like to call it, which is supposed to be against the man. It's obviously changed over the years. But I think the focus on Mission Impossible being on stuff that was appropriate for its time, such as nuclear warheads, such as spying, such as having basically a honeypot in your crew, such as everybody having a role. You saw this in a lot of films. Spy Who Came In From a Cold, tremendous film. Go check that out if you're into some very serious kind of war stuff. You could see it in, of course, James Bond. I mean, starting off in the early 60s and getting more popular. Obviously, Bond's been reimaged from the books to be more TV, or I should say, more movie appropriate. You can talk about Sean Connery and everything, but stuff like the in Goldfinger with the Federal Reserve and everything, that's an interesting plot. So these big global type topics, I think probably one of the early shows that seems like it really tried to tackle them on was definitely Mission Impossible. You got a rogue guy, he's got some nuclear warheads, and you're trying to get rid of him. You're like, okay, I guess we'll make this into TV rather than what's going on at the ranch on some western. So I like how they tackled that, and I liked how they took specialists and fields to try to form a team rather than it just being one person as a hero. Um, I I was stunned by how serious the show kind of took itself a little bit too. I wasn't really prepared for that. Definitely in the 60s, you started getting the introductions of the laugh tracks on things. So there was a certain element of camp to it, whether it was say Batman or whatever. And whatever you like, and that's cool. And as long as you enjoy it and have fun, that's really all that matters. And if you're entertained, it doesn't have to be good. It could be good, but not rewatchable, which I will argue Diner might be one of those type of movies here shortly. But it's one of those movies. That when you think about the series with Tom Cruise in it, yeah, he got a good IP. Yeah, there was a reboot in the 80s because it was popular. And I think Peter Graves is in that reboot too, if I recall correctly. It was on for at least 2 or 3 years there. Um, yeah, Rogue Nation better than the first movie. Here's the thing with Mission Impossible that I think of with Tom Cruise, and especially with Christopher McQuarrie helping out. It's one of those franchises movie-wise that it almost seems like the next movie that's coming out is going to be better. And I don't mean bigger as in terms of spectacle or the stunt, but just better. I don't hate 2, but to me, it's a John Woo film. 3 is when I really paid attention because I think Philip Seymour Hoffman is just fantastic. I think he's incredible, and a lot of people don't like him in it. I don't know why. I just thought, okay, they've got something here. Now, I love Brian De Palma, and you could argue that the first one's more of a Brian De Palma film with a sense of humor because they recruit the cast, right? Tom Cruise gets all his people in the first 30 minutes, they're all killed off. I mean, that's kind of funny, but that's Brian De Palma will do that. And thank you for that, Mr. De Palma. But once they get to 3 and it gets kind of serious with the whole rabbit's foot and accounting attendant, he shoots his wife. Take my money, Tom Cruise, Philip Seymour Hoffman. It's great. And then you're right with Rogue Nation. Wow, they really had a great idea of how to use CGI and the locations they were in to have a scene and keep it building, such as, the Burj Khalifa or whatever the name of the building is and the sandstorm coming and what they had to do with it. Phenomenal. And then, of course, 5, everyone's like, holy shit. And then 6, you're like, oh my God. I like the last one. I feel it's a bit different. I definitely feel like they've already pivoted and you can feel that the end's coming. Don't have a problem with it. But you can get to a point where you can get into a film and be like, okay, enough's enough. Kind of like what Seinfeld, the TV show. If you've never seen it, the way to describe it is that's a show about nothing. And Seinfeld himself, people would say, "Hey, man, we were going to give you 100 million to do one more season of it," and he turned it down because he goes, "No, I just found out at a certain point enough was enough. We are white hot. End it while it's on a good note." And I feel like the Mission Impossible movie franchise is in that position right now. So I think they definitely did a bit of a handing off of the torch to the woman in there, who I thought did a fine job in it. But it's still as fun. It's still as good. I'm really looking forward to the next one. But again, keeping these things that come from the TV show here in these first 2 episodes, I thought, okay, I know most people will think about Spock, Leonard Nimoy being a part of the crew, and they also, of course, think about Peter Graves from the University of Minnesota, the Golden Gophers, as it were. He's not there yet, but it is cool to see the guy go into a shop, like I say, get the assignment, check it out, and of course, back then everything was analog, so he had the pictures in the clear case there that kept a nice, neat fingerprint free, and you'd have to go through piles of stuff. Whereas now everything would be like on your cell phone or whatever. So that was kind of neat if you like that retro kind of look. The other thing too I wanted to point out that I thought was kind of neat is that even though a lot of Mission Impossible was filmed, I guess in central LA and then the Valley and San Fernando Valley and all those areas around there, wherever they were going to go to Kerplakistan or whatever little tiny island it was or foreign place, they just put it somewhere off on the side and you just think it's there and it kind of works. But another thing too is when you watch a lot of movies and RDV, who covers action movies with me primarily on Tuesday nights, we've pointed this out a lot of times too, especially with his eye. It's really, really cool when you're watching something being shot in a different decade because when you watch the background stuff, that can be interesting if it's shot on location because you get to see, even though they rope off areas and they have a lot of extras, you still get to see what people looked like back then. And the 70s definitely had a certain kind of style to it. A lot of people still walk around in hats and suits everywhere you go. It's not like today where, like, if somebody wears a suit, you go, okay, what government agency does it work for? Because nobody wears suits anymore, right? So I liked how Mission Impossible just really was tight on the writing early on in the episode. But then in the second act, as it kind of set up and unfolded, it got quieter. And then in the third part there, once pretty much everything was done, roll credits, end. No people laughing and joking and goofing at the end or whatever. This is pretty tight TV. They did a lot early on to get you hooked into the episode. They got you emotionally committed to it. Then they kind of almost treat it like a movie. They were just let the scenes unfold and let you kind of see what was going on. And I think that's very, very smart. I don't think that's anything that's a revelation when it comes to making TV or movies, but people do have different styles, right? I mentioned before how one of the things that's great about Mission Impossible, the movie franchise, is that specifically in this last one here with 7, they're going to talk to you about what's going on and give you the setup, and that's kind of cool and geeky. In 3, for example, oh, we're just going to have to sneak into the Vatican and steal something. It's like that's impossible. That's the whole point. And here's how we're going to do it. And you're like, okay, I'm on board with this. So you don't have to think. You can be watching and entertaining yourself with it. I think that generally the show probably is going to get a little more seasoned as it goes on once it hits its full cast and crew. I really don't know too much about it because I've only seen some episodes as a kid that I don't recall them, and certainly not with this original crew. But it's a very diverse cast. It's not just diverse in terms of sex and color, but also ability. It reminds me of movies and heist films that were starting to get popular, such as To Catch a Thief, which is tremendous, but basically a solo venture with Cary Grant in it, a Hitchcock film, of course. But also, if you think of the Rat Pack with Frank Sinatra and just excuses to make movies to make money, drink booze, and chase women, and that would be, of course, Ocean's 11, which got bastardized down, of course, in the 90s and aughts or whatever you want to call it. But there's just something about a heist film that is can be cool, it can be hip, it can be kind of sexy. You're rooting for the person that's supposed to be the villain, which is the person doing the stealing. You like the intricacies of what's going on. You like how it doesn't necessarily have to involve guns and violence. It can be more about, hey, this is my skill set, let me use it. So you see me as a fully functional member of a team. That allows everybody who's an actor or actress to kind of illuminate themselves a little bit and get a little bit of a rub from everybody else because you can't just do it all. And Star Trek did a very good job of that. You know what Mr. Spock's role was as the chief science officer, Scotty the engineer. You knew all these things. So I think TV audiences at this point were getting ready to absorb really good television. And I will say this, I do think generally TVs and movies are better, say 60s and 70s. And I think roughly in the 80s, they started to wind down and tail off in terms of quality. I've made the argument before that since, the 80s and 90s with additional cable television shows or channels and whatnot, and of course the internet, that you've got a lot more content that has to be out there. So your overall quality is going to drop. But it disappoints me today when there's very few things on TV that I think are very sharp and witty. Most of the time, they're done by people that are very, very old and had a lot of experience with it, and they know what it is they're trying to do rather than, hey, let's just do this. It works, and reaching for the lowest common denominator. Right now, after these first two episodes of Mission Possible, I would say that they definitely don't do that. But I do think they've got some seasoning that they need to do. There are a bunch of great ingredients going on. I kind of wonder how much they were restricted by television standards at that time, because there's a scene in here where the model babe part of the crew, she's going up and Mark Lando's in full costume, and one of the bad dudes is getting to talk to him, and she just opens up the door real sultry and just kind of she's in there in almost like a robe, kind of real short thing. She's like, "Oh, General, I didn't realize you were there with company." And she goes back to the other room, and the general looks at Mark Lando's character and he says, "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize you were busy right now. We can talk in the morning." And it's like, that's all you need to do. She doesn't have to flash her tits or be, disgusting or anything like that at all. The allure is what's there and it works. And she's very convincing on it. So, um, definitely an ensemble type of cruise show that if that's your thing, this definitely seems to work so far. And again, we're just taking a look at a couple episodes here and there. This first two here from Mission Impossible season one, I liked them. I didn't know what to expect going into it. I thought it might be a little bit dated. I thought the themes they had were great. I think it's one of those situations where you look at it and you go, I kind of don't care what the plot is as long as I understand that they got to be doing something really quick. What you really want to watch is how they go about doing it and how they overcome the obstacles at the top of their head with what there it is that they're trying to do. We've had some technical difficulties here, so I'm just double checking to see if the man who selected the show, Professor Pix, is available. Right now, I don't see it, so I've pretty much shot my wad as far as what I wanted to say. I will say though, here with Mission Impossible, again, the score is really, really great. Thomas Crown Affair with Steve McQueen in the 60s. That's a must see. I think that's the epitome of heist films. I think that's very romantic on a lot of different levels. I think it captures the individual part to it correctly. Again, this is a group effort here with Mission Impossible. So if that's something you want to check it out. Let us know what you think about it. We'll may make the decision to continue. Normally, we like to do all of a season one of a show that we're covering, just to kind of get our opinions wet on it. Because is it just going to be episode of the week? Is there going to be some of these meta arc storylines that combine some things? Is it going to be like the Love Boat where there's really nothing, but you have your special guest stars of yesteryear showing up, or Fantasy Island? Who knows? But this is all before that, and I got to sit there and say I became aware of Mission Impossible because of the '80s reboot, and I remember my parents being aware of the original show, going, "Oh yeah, the first one was really popular, was on for a long time," and you can see why now. And again, the '80s was the decade where they were not afraid to go back and say reboot, Leave It to Beaver, or Mission Impossible, but they had a lot of the cast members that were in it originally or people involved with it. That's key in making sure you don't lose touch with it, rather than just, hey, let me reboot the Halloween trilogy, do what I want with it, and then have a emo loser Hardy Boy actor guy basically dominate the third film, which I thought was done well for what they're doing, but in no way is in the spirit of Halloween in the movies originally. But wow, how far we've come with that too. And be interesting to talk about other franchises. Halloween comes up here. So for Professor Pixel, hopefully I nailed some of the points he wanted to talk about here on his first two episodes. I was curious to see what his young 20-something mind would offer in terms of the way he viewed these two episodes. But T, I'm glad you showed up tonight, as well as everybody else here in chat. Let us know if you've got any particular suggestions for shows you'd like us to cover. We've talked about Backstage Millennium. We've talked about X-Files. We've talked about Hannibal. We've talked about a lot of different things. The Jeremy Brett version of Sherlock Holmes from the late 80s and early 90s over off of was ITV or BBC, you name it, we'll have a tendency to take a look at and cover it here because that's what we like to do here on the Extreme Movie Show. And of course, this particular show tonight, Extreme TV. Guys, thank you for listening. Thanks for getting the word out about us. Have a good night. And as far as later tonight goes, in a few minutes, we're going to be going over the third film in the Hammer Horror Karstein trilogy of lesbian vampires, Twins of Evil. We'll be checking that out here shortly on the other link. I'll be posting that again here soon. It was on the Twitter feed. And then at 7 o'clock, we're all going to be getting together and be talking about, I believe it's 1982 Diner. That's going to be a very interesting discussion. So I hope to see all you guys there. Have a good night, everybody. Stay extreme.